I'd like to start by thanking everyone for coming, in particular our friends at SARB for their very generous sponsorship and their ongoing relationship with ASPI. I'd also like to thank my colleagues for their assistance, contributions, sesame seeds, and support over what has been a rather intense few months since I started at ASPI in February. And in particular, I'd like to thank Mark Thompson, who did the previous 16 cost of defence briefs, not only for bequeathing me a huge archive of historical data, but in particular for his kindness and understanding in not showing up tonight. There's enough pressure as it is without the master looking over your shoulder. So I'd like to start by asking you all a question, because I think it might be useful to keep the answer in the back of your minds as we go through the rest of the presentation. The Future Frigate project will reach initial operating capability in the late 2020s. That's when the first frigate will be in service and providing real capability. The Future Submarine will reach initial operating capability sometime in the early to mid-2030s. The question is, how much will the two projects have spent between them to reach that point? If you've had a quick dip into the report, you might have an idea. Any takers? No one's brave enough to... Michael!
$19.7 billion.
That's a very good guess. A very, very good guess. It's like we've got one brain between us. And the answer, at least according to our analysis, is around $20 billion. So by the time those two projects deliver their first platform into service, we think we will have spent around $20 billion. Well, what's that equivalent to? Well, one example would be the entire cost of the Joint Strike Fighter project with the Super Hornets thrown in for good measure. So that's how much cash Defence will have tied up for over a decade before it gets any capability. So I'm not saying cancel the projects, I'm just saying keep that in mind as we go through the presentation. Okay, so this evening I'll sketch out the broader strategic context for Australia's defence investments. Then I'll talk a little about this year's defence budget and some emerging pressures, and then I'll move on to two subjects that this year's budget brief delves into some more detail, namely the government's defence industry policy and the affordability of the naval shipbuilding plan. So Australia's situation is deteriorating. The 2016 Defence White Paper set out 6 drivers that shape our security environment. None has improved since the White Paper appeared, and most have worsened significantly. The existing rules-based global order is under threat. China simply ignores it when it chooses, for example, with its de facto annexation and subsequent militarisation of the South China Sea. First it was islands, then airstrips, then missiles, and just in the last week or so, long-range strategic bombers. That incremental pushing of the boundaries is China's signature move in its broader approach to the world. China is also embarking on creating a new regional order that it seeks to define alone. The current leadership of the US appears unable to decide whether it wants to support the existing order, ignore it, or tear it down. Meanwhile, the relative power gap between the two continues to decrease as China's economy and military grows. US military leaders are now describing China as a peer adversary. And that's interesting for 2 reasons. Firstly, they've dropped the qualifying near from near peer, and they've moved from competitor to adversary. The development of emergent technologies such as cyber, space-based capabilities, artificial intelligence, and hypersonics continues apace. While China still has a lot of ground to make up on the US in terms of conventional military capabilities, there's less ground to make up in many of those emergent technologies. And with its heavy investment in those fields, China may even be ahead. And despite the defeat of Islamic State as a geographic state in Iraq and Syria, we're seeing clear Islamic State links into terrorist attacks in Southeast Asia. The siege of Marawi in the southern Philippines and the string of attacks earlier this month in Indonesia both involved radicals with links to Islamic State and returned fighters from the Middle East. All of these developments are occurring now, not in 10 years' time. Taken together, they suggest that the ADF will be confronted with an increasingly broad spectrum of threats. The question is whether defence can be stretched even further to address them all, or whether it should focus on addressing particular ones. Now, it's important to remember that we are still quite a big fish in the smaller pond of maritime Southeast Asia. On the other hand, we're quite a small fish in the bigger pond of the Indo-Pacific. So we have weight, but we can't do everything, and choices are needed. Unfortunately, the 2016 Defence White Paper doesn't provide clear guidance on prioritisation. Its 3 strategic defence objectives that frame its analysis seem to be all equally weighted in terms of prioritising military capabilities. Under this framework, it's possible to make a case for almost any capability from boots to aircraft carriers. So we think it might be time for the government to revisit some of the White Paper's assumptions, either to confirm that it does in fact set out the right path, or whether it should make some adjustments to that plan. So that's the strategic background that, against which we should look at the 2018 Defence Budget. So overall, the White Paper continues to deliver, the budget continues to deliver the White Paper vision. Here's the big numbers: $36.4 billion for defence, including ASD, the Signals Directorate. 1.35% real growth since last year. So in contrast to much of the Western world, the Australian defence budget is actually growing in real terms. And that's about 1.9% of GDP, give or take. And so let's look at the overall trajectory of the budget. So the blue columns represent defence funding. The little red blobs on top are operational supplementation. Up to this point is history. These 4 years here are the forward estimates covered by the PBS, and this is the period beyond the PBS. So, and the purple line, represents 2% of GDP. So, the government has made 2 defence funding commitments. The first is to increase the defence budget to 2% of GDP by 2021, and it looks like it'll broadly get there. Based on the defence portfolio budget statements and the GDP predictions in the budget papers, it gets pretty close. By our calculation, by 2021, it gets to about 1.98% of GDP. So essentially a rounding error. We're not going to quibble over that. And it's 2 years away, so it's not really worth arguing about. So the government is on track to meet the 2% commitment. And in fact, goes past it here. But the White Paper made a second, different funding commitment. So that Defence could undertake long-term planning without worrying about constant changes to its funding caused by fluctuations in GDP predictions, the White Paper actually decoupled defence funding from GDP and presented a fixed funding line. And again, by our calculations, between the White Paper, so this was the first budget after the White Paper, to the end of the forward estimates, actually the defence budget falls short of that fixed line by a total of around about $5 billion. But that's not disastrous out of a total funding over those 6 years of over $220 billion. But the issue is beyond the forward estimates, it gets worse. So these are the White Paper's fixed numbers. This is a projection of GDP based on this year's budget papers. And we see that actually 2% is less than the White Paper prediction. And that discrepancy is, in these years, over $5 billion a year. Now, and so the obvious question is, what's Defence's long-term planning based on? Is it based upon the White Paper line, so the blue columns, or is it based upon a 2% prediction of GDP? Because if it's based on the White Paper numbers, it could actually fall short by $5 billion every year in its planning. Okay, but nevertheless, the defence budget is growing in real terms, and that growth continues to be centred on Defence's capital program. Okay, so here are the sort of the 3 traditional big buckets that the budget is divided up into: capital, personnel, and operating. That's where we are right now. So while capital investment has historically been the poor cousin along side personnel and operating funding, and in 12-13 it really bottomed out below 20%. And in some ways you could argue defence is still kind of clawing back from that. The three now are roughly equivalent, so there's sort of virtually no daylight between them now. And interestingly, if we keep following the forward estimates trajectory, capital for pretty much the first time ever, I think, exceeds the other two. So the money is going into capital. But we argue it has to if defence is going to be able to afford the future force. Okay, defence has used that increase to invest heavily in important things, such as remediating its worn-down infrastructure. And while the shipbuilding enterprise is still in its early days, many other capital investments are delivering capability. Air warfare destroyers, P-8 maritime patrol aircraft, trucks, battlefield communications, and new tactical airlifters. And the Air Force's transformation into a true fifth-generation force is well underway. There's no doubt we are getting a much more capable ADF. But that costs money. The Joint Strike Fighter project, for example, will hit $2 billion in annual expenditure this year. I think it's the first time project's gone over $2 billion. That's a lot of cash to pump through the system. And it's probably going to stay there for about 4 to 5 years. And sorry, I just want to say that anything I say about shipbuilding taking a long time should not be taken as a criticism of the people in those projects. I know the people in defence who have got OPV up and approved, who have got future frigate, hopefully to government consideration sometime around about now, have moved heaven and earth to get it there. And that's people in Navy, it's people in CASG, it's people in DSTG, it's people in contestability, it's people in the portfolio management team. So it should not be read in any way as a criticism that people in defence are not working as hard as they can. They are working harder than anyone can reasonably expect them to. And there are other good news stories, such as the submarine enterprise turning Collins availability around to meet international benchmarks. And there's only 3 projects currently on the projects of concern list. So these are all real good news stories. But you pay ASPI to raise concerns, and so I'll give you some things to be concerned about. Full-time ADF personnel numbers are programmed to grow to nearly 59,800 this year, on the way to the white paper target of 62,000. But actual growth has been slow, and Navy, unfortunately, potentially the service whose future platform growth is greatest, is actually going backwards. In the PBS, funding for personnel effectively flatlines at less than 1% real increase annually over the forward estimates. That seems to be inviting future cost pressures, since ADF numbers are meant to increase and individual personnel costs have historically increased in real terms. Civilian numbers fall by around 2,000 this year. That's mainly due to the Australian Signals Directorate becoming a statutory agency. Overall, however, net civilian numbers remain unchanged at the white paper level. That is, well below where they were 5 years ago. In fact, around 5,000 less than where they were. And that's likely to rely continued reliance on contractors, because somebody has to do the work necessary to deliver the future force. And so again, getting OPV up and approved, getting Land 400 up and approved, getting frigates up and approved has relied heavily on contractors. Also, sustainment budgets appear to be increasing faster than predicted. Between last year's PBS and the mid-year additional estimates update, the sustainment budget increased by $1.5 billion, or 16%. And this year's sustainment budget is around $1 billion more than predicted last year. Now, some of this is likely to be due to different accounting practices that Defence has adopted. So it may not actually be a real change, but there's something going on there. But you do get the sense that perhaps the sustainment requirements of an increasingly complex force were underestimated in the white paper, and Defence is having to adjust. And that could be one reason why Defence is underachieving against its predicted capital spend. Yes, overall capital spending is increasing at a healthy rate, but it's likely to fall short of the spend predicted in the 2016-17 forward estimates. We'll fall short by maybe around $4 billion or so. Now, half of that, I suspect, is due to foreign exchange adjustments, so it's probably a $2 billion change. And out of a capital investment budget over those years of probably 40 to 50 billion, it's not, again, a huge shortfall. But it probably confirms, first, that it's always hard to ramp up investment spending quickly. And secondly, the increase in the sustainment budget had to come from somewhere. Perhaps more concerning is that investment in ICT appears to have crashed last year. Again, between the PBS and additional estimates, it fell by 72%, or $644 million. There's no explanation for that in the PBS. It may be that ICT projects failed to deliver on schedule, or it may be that sustaining legacy ICT systems has sucked funds away from investment in new acquisitions. Since there's a complete lack of public reporting on the ICT program, it's impossible to know what happened. And this lack of transparency on ICT is particularly troubling, as the Integrated Investment Program foreshadows over $10 billion of investment in ICT projects to help fix Defence's broken backbone. These projects are not only central to Defence's corporate information systems, but they're the glue that holds its warfighting capabilities together. And this lack of transparency extends beyond the ICT program. While the government is claiming to be approving record numbers of projects, there's no public record of what they are, let alone information on their scope, schedule, or budget. So I think the last time the Defence Annual Report gave a complete list of approved projects was back in 13-14. Since then, that transparency is diminished. So this is our assessment of what was approved in 16-17. We've really got no idea. I've got really no idea what was approved in 17-18. And for the first year, the PBS doesn't include a list of project approvals scheduled for the coming year. So that's our assessment of what's coming up for approval in 18-19. And that's unfortunate because capital investment projects lie at the heart of the government's white paper plan. And so government and defence should probably do better at transparency. Okay, so that's covering this year's budget itself, and I'd like to move on to look at two issues that the cost of defence looks at in a little more detail this year. The first is the government's defence industry policy, which is the focus of Chapter 5. A few years ago, it seemed as if everybody had an opinion on which fighter planes and submarines Australia should buy. Even my mother had an opinion on fighter planes. But now the discussion has moved on to whether and what we should build in Australia. At some level, this isn't a debate that can be resolved by data alone, as it involves issues of identity and ideology. At one end of the spectrum, there are the economic rationalists, including my predecessor Mark to some degree, who argue that there's no net national benefit in subsidising uncompetitive industries, whether they be car manufacturing or shipbuilding. And if we look, Australia over the last decade has been the world's 5th biggest arms importer, based on SIPRI data, but only the world's 20th arms exporter. But the economic rationalists can argue that, well, that expenditure, as the 5th biggest arms importer, has enabled us to get access to the most advanced military technologies in the world when we need them at a price we can generally afford. And we spend $37 billion a year taking overseas holidays, over $21 billion a year on cars, and $25 billion on importing petroleum. So why is everyone getting so concerned about the $6 billion we spend overseas on military capability? At the other end of the spectrum, there are those who argue, whether for reasons of sovereignty, jobs, prestige, or even parochialism, that we should do as much as we can here. What sort of country do we want to be? Like those that make up the top 10, such as Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Algeria, or Egypt? Or do we see ourselves as one of these countries on the top 10 exporters, such as the US, the UK, France, Germany, Sweden, and Canada? And in between, there are those who see merit in both sides. Perhaps we should be doing more to keep some of the money that we send offshore to buy arms here in Australia, but perhaps not at the 30 to 40% premium that the Rand Corporation suggested we were paying for shipbuilding, particularly if it means less capability for our servicemen and women. And so the government's industry policy seems to include elements of all of those positions, which means that sometimes it appears to be inconsistent. Its policy documents state that ultimately developing Australian industry and defence exports is about improved capability for the ADF. Yet in practice, it appears to favour building in Australia, regardless of any cost premium and any consequent decrease in output delivered to the ADF. Ultimately, our view is that we should support Australian defence industry when the costs and risks are understood and it makes sense to do so. However, based on the Australian National Audit Office's analysis, it doesn't appear that Defence understands the premiums involved in local builds, so it's hard to see how robust the business cases for local builds can be. That said, once the government has made the initial decision to build in Australia, its choice of submarines, offshore patrol vessels and armoured vehicles appears to have been based primarily on capability, and hopefully it will also be the case on the future frigate decision. But at that point, much of the risk involved in the local build premium has already been locked in. For their part, the international primes seem to have gotten the government's message that to win business they need robust Australian industry plans and partnerships with local companies and universities. Centres of excellence and cooperative research ventures have been established and in fact seem to be popping up like mushrooms almost daily. So industry seems to be meeting the government's demand that it put more of its own skin in the game. The government seems to want the local defence industry landscape to change from one made up of a very small number of international primes and a very large number of pretty small SMEs to one with a much larger local middle class. Whether that happens remains to be seen. But one thing that could help that occur are the innovation programs announced in the white paper. They do appear to be getting money out the door, and while it's early days, anecdotally at least, we seem to be seeing local success stories. And so this is an innovation report that came out recently, and I just say that this is a fantastic example of transparency from defence. You know, I'm sure there's things in there that people can quibble about, but it actually gives real numbers, how much money's approved, who it's going to, and what we're getting for it. So it is possible to have good transparency. Okay, compared to the dollars spent on things like shipbuilding, the funding involved is small, around about 0.5% of the defence budget. So why not take a bit of a punt and double it or even triple it? Not only would this support the government's broader innovation agenda, as well as help grow local small enterprises, but will also help us keep up with other nations' investments in the emergent technologies I talked about earlier. And since much of the future force is still some time off, enhancing Defence's existing capabilities through innovation makes sense. Now, of course, Defence, and we Australians more broadly, would have to overcome our anti-intellectual scepticism. On the one hand, we extol Australian scientists' record of innovation and achievement, but on the other hand, we starve of funding. And speaking as a former defence person, this sentiment seems to be particularly pervasive in defence. It seems to be if you leave scientists to themselves, they'll just conduct science experiments. But perhaps we should actually let them do more science experiments. In terms of exports, and the government's defence export policy came out earlier this year, the goal of becoming a top 10 defence exporter seems not only overly ambitious, but also distracting. Rather than focusing on exporting entire platforms, there's probably more benefit to be had by leveraging our involvement in the shipbuilding and armoured vehicle projects into greater access for Australian industry into the international prime supply chains, not just for projects in Australia, but for projects that they're conducting around the world, not just here. And that can achieve real economic benefits long before any possibility of submarines exports is realised, which is probably a mirage in and of itself. But gaining that access won't happen by itself. France, if we go back, France is the world's 4th biggest arms importer, and in fact the ratio of its exports to imports is the highest in the world. So they are very canny, and they do not conduct, their defence industry is not a charity aimed at nation building in other countries. So it will require committed action both by our government and by defence to secure that access. And that brings us to the second area that we've examined in more detail, the affordability of the naval shipbuilding plan, which is the focus of Chapter 6. There's no getting around the fact that building modern warships is expensive, very expensive. And there's two numbers that perhaps warrant closer consideration than the $89 billion headline figure that's widely quoted. In a world of continuous build, total numbers are essentially irrelevant, because as one project winds down, the next one starts up. There's a beginning, but there's no end. And they're also irrelevant even if the public numbers bear any resemblance to reality in the first place. And I would just say that we would do well to exercise some scepticism about public numbers. If you go back to the 2009 Defence Capability Plan, the number in there for 12 future submarines was $1.5 billion. It's now over $50 billion, and I don't think it's because Defence's estimate has gone up 3,000%. So the first number is the $20 billion figure that I mentioned earlier. That's a lot of cash to have tied up while our strategic circumstances deteriorate and our current platforms age. As ASPI has suggested previously, it's probably worth looking at what Defence can do in the meantime in the form of cost-effective ways to enhance capability sooner. And I've spoken about additional investment in innovation. And the second number is the roughly $3.5 to $4 billion in annual cash flow that we estimate the shipbuilding plan will require once it's up and running. So that's $3.5 to $4 billion every year. That's a lot of money. How much is it in relative terms? Okay, so hopefully you can see the light blue here. It hasn't come out very well. Okay, we've built ships before. I'm not saying, ASPI's not saying we can't build ships. And in fact, we have built two classes of ships before at the same time. So in many ways, the Naval Shipbuilding Plan is not new or unique. So we built the Anzacs and the Collins at roughly at the same time. And between them, they peaked at around 50% of Defence's capital equipment budget. Okay. But that was a peak. That was a peak. So the projects ramped up. They ramped up, delivered, and ramped down. That's the normal trajectory for defence projects, and it creates room for other acquisitions. So, for example, it created room before for the Hornet acquisition, okay, which that one single project by itself peaked at 45% of Defence's capital investment budget. But it ramped up and then ramped down, creating room for shipbuilding, which in turn ramped up and ramped down. Just incidentally, over the last decade, domestic shipbuilding, which has mainly been the AWD, has averaged only around 13% of the capital budget. The big difference now is that the naval shipbuilding enterprise will consume potentially 30% or close to maybe a third even of Defence's capital equipment budget in perpetuity because it is ongoing and it has no end. So that's about there. Okay. On the one hand, yes, it does smooth out the peaks and troughs. But on the other hand, since it sits at that level forever, it limits the room available for other capabilities. And since continuous local build appears now to be the government's policy more broadly, there are likely to be other builds locked in forever, potentially armoured vehicles at over $1 billion a year. It will be a very brave government, I think, once Land 400 stops delivering to turn off the 1,500 jobs involved in that. And we've already seen the protected vehicles, so with the flow from Bushmaster into Hawkeye, that the governments, more than one, have wanted to preserve jobs in Bendigo. And so potentially that locked-in line is not here, but potentially somewhere up here. And so all of this further shrinks the space for other capabilities and future flexibility. Now, Navy is essentially undergoing a transformation that will double its tonnage through the acquisition of more and bigger ships. So around about a decade ago, that's where we were in total tonnage. That's about where we are now when the air warfare destroyers enter service. And that's the full white paper fleet with all of the future frigates and all of the future submarines. So from about 140,000 tonnes to nearly 300,000 tonnes, based on public source information. Okay, now, so sustainment costs will increase. I'm not saying that size is a one-for-one kind of direct correlation with cost, but there is a correlation there because not only are all of these ships bigger, but they're more complex than these ships back here. More systems, more capability means more dollars. More dollars to buy, more dollars to operate. So Submarine and frigate sustainment, which are currently the largest and third largest sustainment lines in defence, are likely to triple and double, respectively. Submarines alone could cost $2 billion a year to operate, on top of the $2 billion a year to build, which potentially could require 10% of Defence's total budget just for one capability. Granted, we're still a long way from having all of the future frigates and future submarines, so probably last submarine number 12 will arrive somewhere between 2050 and 2054 based on the Naval Shipbuilding Plan. Okay, so that's some time off, but at a time when Western navies are shrinking across the board due to the cost of building and operating modern warships, the fact that we're moving in the other direction raises questions about affordability. But you say, what about the 30 to 40% RAND premium that the Naval Shipbuilding Plan will reduce? Won't eliminating stop-start shipbuilding programs reduce that? Well, it may to some degree. I'm not saying it won't won't reduce it. But a lot of that premium was driven by overall productivity, not just stop-start building. So we need to significantly improve productivity. And continuous build also introduces other premiums. So 12 vessels is probably not sufficient to support continuous build economically. So 12 submarines, 12 major surface combatants. To stretch out the life of type to something resembling a return on investment, the Naval Shipbuilding Plan locks in a 2-year drumbeat. So hence a 24-year life of type for each of those ships. But 24 years falls well short of the 30 or more years that constitute the economic life of type of a modern warship. So we'll be potentially retiring ships early. Furthermore, a 2-year drumbeat is not an efficient build rate. Anzac and Collins each had a drumbeat of a little over a year. So we're potentially building into the Naval Shipbuilding Plan an inefficient, drawn-out build cycle, which is unlikely to help bring down the RAND premiums. Also, a 2-year fixed drumbeat means that it will be a very long time before the future fleet is delivered, while our strategic environment is deteriorating. So it's going to be beyond 2040 for the 9th frigate and beyond 2050 for the 12th future submarine. However, if we try and build faster to bring them into service sooner, we reach the next valley of death sooner. So to avoid the valley of death, you need to keep building continuously, which either means we replace our ships sooner or we get an even bigger, more expensive fleet. So overall, the continuous naval shipbuilding program puts us in a very, very difficult bind, and I don't pretend I have the solution. But it's an issue we need to think about. Plus, there are other cost pressures competing with shipbuilding for funds. The future sustainment cost of the Joint Strike Fighter is a big unknown. But if it's anywhere close to the jump from Classic Hornet to Super Hornet, which is about 3 times as much per aircraft, it's going to be very hard to absorb. So in short, the mega projects, in particular shipbuilding, have the potential to crowd out other capabilities. Historically, it's the enablers such as facilities and ICT holding everything together that suffer, hence we get into the situation of broken backbones. But it could be that the big projects will also distort the overall force structure, and we're already seeing signs of that. Just last week, the ANAO noted that Defence may have to increase the future submarine projects budget by $6.9 billion even before the first future submarine is delivered. And that can only come from other areas of planned expenditure, most likely other capital investments. So that's enough for shipbuilding. Sorry, I didn't really want to bum you out, but that's just our reading of it. And I'm certainly not saying cancel the ships. Okay, because the media, the public and defence often argue past each other when discussing the cost of military equipment, we've included a chapter in the brief this year, Chapter 7, that illustrates how defence costs major acquisitions and shows while the sticker price that you might find on Wikipedia or on US budget papers is actually very different from Defence's total project budget. And hopefully this will contribute to a better discussion around what the cost of defence and its capabilities actually is. Okay, so to sum up, sorry I've gone over time, I'm standing between you and dinner, I apologise. So the government is broadly meeting its commitment to get the defence budget to 2% of GDP. But the content and timing of the White Paper investment program has not been revisited, despite changes for the worst in our strategic environment. Funding pressures are already emerging, with most likely more to come in sustainment and personnel, right at the time when a large share of the investment budget is tied up in shipbuilding. And finally, the naval shipbuilding program is a journey that we are signing ourselves, our children and our grandchildren up to. The only way it's going to work is if the Australian people support it, and to do that they need to understand it. To understand it, there needs to be informed debate and also public confidence that the government is making the right decisions for the right reasons. Otherwise, cynicism and parochialism will prevail, and we're already seeing signs of that with the public seagull-like squabbling between states. To prevent that happening, the government needs to demand that Defence provide greater public transparency in its planning and reporting to support informed understanding and public discussion. Thank you very much for listening, and again, my apologies for going over.